Okay, so to get started with adding MongoDB to our backend, first of all, you'll probably want to check and make sure that you don't already have it installed locally, which you can do by typing mongod --version. Okay, and if you see something like this, right, 5.0.1 or 5.0.2 or 5 point something, then you're good and you don't need to install it. But if you get something like mongod command not found, then what you're going to need to do is Google MongoDB community download. You are going to have to Google that specifically because it's actually very hard to find on MongoDB's website. They've unfortunately replaced a lot of this with their more paid models. But anyway, you're going to want to download MongoDB community server, and you'll probably want to use 5.0.2 or 5.0.1 or whatever version you have, because I'm using, as you saw, 5.0.1. Okay, so you just need to select that version, select whatever platform you're planning on installing it onto, right? That would be Windows if you're working on a Windows computer, or Linux, some kind of Linux if you're working on a Linux machine. And you're going to just want to download that and walk through the installation process. It's pretty straightforward. Okay? So anyway, once you have MongoDB installed and set up, you're going to want to make sure you have it running in the background. And the way that you can check that is by typing Mongo and hitting enter. And if it opens a shell like this is the Mongo shell, then everything is installed and Mongo's running correctly. If you get something like unable to connect, you'll need to just Google how to get MongoDB up and running on your machine. It's going to be different depending on what kind of operating system you have, etc. Okay, so now that we have MongoDB installed and set up, the first thing that we're going to do is take this fake in-memory database that we had in our server file and insert it into an actual Mongo database locally. So here's what this is going to look like. The first thing you're going to want to do is you're going to want to connect to the Mongo shell by typing Mongo and hitting enter. Okay, and as I said, this is the MongoDB shell. Basically, what we can do in here is run MongoDB commands, which allow us to, manage our databases, create data, delete data, update data, etc. Okay, so the first thing that we're going to want to do is create a new database for our application here, and the way that you can do that is simply by typing the command use and whatever you want the database name to be. Okay, so if we want to have this be something like full stack react to-dos, right, something like that, then what you can do is hit enter, and you should see switched to FSR-to-dos, and basically that means that any commands we run now in the shell will be affecting that database. And if you ever want to switch databases, right, if you had, let's say, a development database and a production database, or for some reason you just had to manage more than one database, all you have to do to switch between them is use that same use command. Anyway, once we have that database created, what we're going to do is insert our fake to-dos array into that database. And the way that we do that is by saying db dot, and then we can type the collection name. So in our case, we'll want this to be to-dos. And collections, by the way, are sort of the NoSQL equivalent to tables, right? So we'll say collections are roughly equal to tables, very, very roughly, right? Because there really are very few differences between them, besides the fact that collections and tables both contain similar data, so to speak, okay? They're both meant to represent a resource, is what I'm trying to say here. Okay, so now that we have db.todos, the way that we insert documents into MongoDB, one way is just by saying insert one, and then specifying the document that you want to insert, right? So if we wanted to insert our first to-do here, we could say ID 123, text, go to the grocery store, and is completed, false. Right? It's all just basic JavaScript syntax when you're inserting data like this. Okay, and we could hit enter now, and what we'll see is it says acknowledged true and inserted ID, object ID, blah, 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 blah. Now, what this means, right, this acknowledged true thing, that just means that everything went well and that that document was successfully inserted. This inserted ID is the randomly generated ID that MongoDB will automatically assign to any data that we insert into the database. Now, this does kind of make the ID property that we have on our fake to-dos a little bit obsolete. So what we can do is simply remove those and use MongoDB's ID property instead. Now, the difference between MongoDB's ID property and our own ID property is that MongoDB simply puts an underscore before it, like underscore ID. Okay? So now that we've inserted a piece of data into our to-dos collection in our FSR to-dos database, it's the way that we can actually see all of the documents, right? And documents is the NoSQL equivalent of records in an SQL database. The way that we can see all of the documents in a given collection is by saying DB, and then the collection name, and then we can say find. And the argument that we pass to find is an object that contains the criteria we want to use for filtering. Now, if we want to get all of our to-dos, as we do here, we just pass an empty object and hit enter. And we'll see that the one to-do that we've inserted is printed out to the console like this, right? So we can see that we have all of the properties that we've inserted, and additionally we have this underscore ID property that MongoDB has inserted for us. Now, when you print out a lot of data, right, obviously it can get a little bit messy reading it in the console, so what you can do is you can actually add at the end of this .pretty, and that will basically take your JSON and format it nicely to make it a lot easier to read, right? This is great when you have to scroll through data and you're looking for something, to not have to try and read it all unformatted. So that's how we find basic documents inside MongoDB using the MongoDB shell. Let's insert our other to-do, right? And to do that, we're going to use the same command as before. We're going to say db.todos.insert1. And we'll just leave the ID off of this one because we're going to start using MongoDB's built-in ID property instead. What we're going to do is say text learn full stack development and is completed true. Okay, and we're going to hit enter. We're going to see the same acknowledged true and inserted ID things printed out. So the next thing that we're going to do, well, here, if you want to see all of our to-dos in the database now, you can just say db.todos.find.pretty, and you'll see all of the to-dos that our database contains so far. Okay, so that is how we create and read items in our Mongo databases. Updating items in our Mongo databases is pretty straightforward as well. It's a little trickier than just inserting items, but it's nothing that you can't handle, I'm sure. So to demonstrate this one, let's say that we want to change the text of one of our to-dos. Okay? The way that we would do that, we would say db.todos.update. Okay, and the first argument that we pass to update is that same filter that we passed to find. Okay, so that'll basically filter out all of the items inside our to-dos collection and only apply those updates to those items. So if we wanted to apply a given update to all of our items, right, if we wanted to add an extra property to all of our items, what we would do is we would just say update with an empty object as the first argument. And for the second argument, this is where something called a MongoDB query object comes in. And it's just a basic JavaScript object, but it contains some special properties that will basically tell MongoDB how we want to update our documents. So the most common one to see in this one is $set. Okay? Basically what this does is the value we pass to it will contain the keys and the new values that we want to set on the corresponding documents that match this filter. So if we wanted to set all of our to-dos isCompleted properties to false, the way that we could do that is we would say $set. The object we pass to that would then be isCompleted false. Okay? And that's what that would look like. Basically, this is telling MongoDB, for everything that matches this criteria here, set isCompleted to false. Okay? And we're going to see a slightly different thing printed out here. This is a write result, which just contains basic information about what the result of that operation was. Okay, and if we find our to-dos again, which we can do by saying db.todos.find.pretty, what we'll see, well, actually, it looks like nothing was changed, and there is a very good reason for that. And that reason is that the update method doesn't like it when we pass an empty filter, which honestly I forgot about until now. In order to update all of your items in your database, what you're going to need to do instead is use the update many method. Okay, so if we hit enter now, what we'll see is that it says acknowledged true, matched count 2, and modified count 1. So in other words, there were two things that matched the filter we passed, that is this empty object here, and only one of those was modified because one of them already had is completed equal to false. Okay? So if we find our to-dos again with that same command, we're going to see that is completed is false on all of them. Okay, so that's how to update items in MongoDB. If we wanted to just update a single item, what we would do is we would say db.todos.update, and for this filter, we usually end up passing in the ID. So let's say that we wanted to modify this Learn Full Stack Development one. I'm going to copy that object ID thing there. And what we're going to do is set the text to something different. We're going to say something like set text, Learn Full Stack React Development. And we'll hit enter there. And we'll see n modified 1. Okay? So now if we find our to-dos again, we'll see that that property has been updated inside this to-do. Okay, so the last thing that we're going to look at here is how to remove to-dos. And the way that we do that in MongoDB is using the remove method. So what we're going to do is say db.todos.remove. And if you want to remove all of the items in a collection, which I normally wouldn't recommend, is you can just pass an empty filter like that there, right? And if you hit enter now, you'll see that it says n removed 2, right? In other words, we removed 2 documents. And if you try and find our to-dos again, you'll see that nothing gets printed out. And I wanted to use this as a way to show you how to insert more than one document at a time. So the way that we can do that is by saying db.todos.insertMany. Okay, and basically what we do is we just pass an array of data that we want to insert. So let's just copy and paste our fake to-dos here for now. We're going to paste that inside of here and close off the square bracket and the parenthesis, and we're going to hit enter. And we should see that it says acknowledged true, and inserted IDs is now an array of IDs that were added to those objects that we inserted. Okay, so our database is all set up now for our app. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.